Want to welcome everybody to the July 2024. We're halfway through the year this year. Sorry, Craig and Betsy cannot be here today. They're in the Great Lakes trying to cool off. Anyway, Craig asked me to run the meeting in his absence. I said that was fine. One of the things I wanted to ask you, did all of you or any of you read the newsletter? All right. Oh, people are here. Good. That's great. There's a lot of things in the newsletter. One of the things that Dennis pointed out to me is incorrect, though, is the September meeting is going to be on Cuba and not Walter Marty's presentation, which is to be determined. That's going to now be on August 6th.
Yeah, Walter is, he's working on it.
Okay, to be determined. Yes, we have today. Workshops. I was going to ask David, did anybody go to the June workshop or did we have? Can you tell me how it went?
The lighting.
Yeah, the lighting workshop. I'm sorry I didn't go. I had a conflict. Couldn't be there. So you want to tell us about who it went? Was it?
Craig's was more down to earth and I understood it better,
Okay.
so I loved it.
Okay. Did you go, Scott?
Yeah, I particularly liked David's part, because he got into fundamentals, which was really important. And in fact, I just FYI, I've been in communication with him a couple of times about that. And I was actually hoping he would be here because he wanted me to do a spreadsheet like he showed there of distance from target and light intensity and then f-stop.
Okay.
And he convinced me to do this. I did it with my system. And the whole thing is I'm having discussions with him about TTL. So I did it with manual and with my TTL, which I wanted to discuss with him. And now I'm upset he's not here. So, but I thought his part was really good.
And I haven't gotten this. There is another shop later this month, July the 13th. It is on the ABC's of Fish program. It's going to be here at Bayland from 12:30 to 3:30. So if anybody wants to go or can get mixed up as to what fish you see, you might want to come. It is also on Zoom. That information is in the newsletter as to how to connect to that. Gadget of the month. Did anybody bring a gadget of the month this month? What do you got there, girl?
And this tour. That's not a gadget.
Sure. And she made this thing and surprised me with
It's pretty neat.
it. She ended up all of it, even all this little intricate type stitching. T-shirts apparently presented a special talent because they're a different material. And so she actually put some backing on the T-shirt so that different have different. Yeah, so anyway, she's selling them. I've already ordered one. You can custom design it. She also does memory quilt, which she did for her father. She took all the stuff when he died and his shirts and made memory quilts for every grandchild and the shirts that they also saw him wear while he was alive. And she also does a memory quilt for all your other hobby stuff, like if your husband has one with airplanes on it, because he does airplanes like that, and all the hobby stuff. So there's a lot of different subjects that you can do on them. So of course mine is food on. So if you're interested, I have a brochure and stuff.
Okay, let's see, Dennis, I was gonna ask you, there is a camera system several people have talked about on Facebook, and I think Dennis knows a little bit about it. Dennis?
You know, I'm not really quite prepared yet to talk about that.
No, I
but
was gonna spring it
I
on.
needed to get it up because I can't remember the name of it. But it's kind of like a GoPro on steroids, it looks like, from what I can tell. I was pretty impressed with it when I saw the specifications on it.
You got it there.
I can get it. Let me check to see if I can find it on Facebook. Let's see. Facebook.
Flyer, give you an update on the BVI trip. One thing you know right now is the date, if anybody was interested in going, and I will hopefully the August meeting have all the costs. But I'm gonna go through with you with what the BVI, excuse me, what the BVI group is from May 10th through May 17th. We're looking at the old 2022 trip, 7 nights accommodation, single or double occupancy, 5 days of diving, 3 days, 3 times daily, including 2 night dives. If we do 2 night dives, we've usually only done 1. And then 1 is on the Rhone, which is really a great dive. I think you've done that. Yeah. Scuba gear cleaning and complimentary storage. And if any of you have ever been with dive BVI, when they clean your gear, they clean your gear. It's not like just a bit in the water. You come home, really don't have to clean it, but I recommend you do anyway. Breakfast daily, lunch on dive trips, and it's either served on board, or we usually go to an island, have lunch at one of the other islands. Nitrox is part of the package. It's 32%. Welcome cocktail party and dinner upon arrival. Farewell dinner and a beach barbecue on the night before we leave. Welcome gift bag, taxes, national park fees, cruising permit fees, and fuel surcharges are all included.
Maybe, hey,
Taxi transport to the ferry islands back, both on arrival and departure included. Taxi transportation, scheduled to and from the marina, and breakfast on diving days. What's not included is the gratuity for diving staff and the breakfast and lunches at the restaurant. One soft drink, something else you gotta pay for. The cost then was $2,100 per diver, double occupancy, 27. Single occupancy. I do not know what the cost is going to be. What they told me is we need to get the cost from the various restaurants that we go to during the dive. And that's only if we get enough people that are interested in going. May 10th through May 17th, 2025.
in my computer.
Let's see. Frank, you want to talk about TGCC and anything else? Yeah.
Okay, TGCC, the diving council right now is in the middle of their scholarship program. All the applications have been received. We have 6 this year. The judging on those to determine the scholarship, who gets the scholarship, or how many we award, will be the 11th. We have at this time, we have one from Chum, which is the City of Houston Underwater Mariners. Tamara Salmon. And we have 2 from HUPS, Charles Warren and Zoe Hawks. And we have 3 from Lunar Fins, Elizabeth Gorman, Kimberly Sambers, and William Cochran. Anyway, decision on that will be made on the 11th. Should be out in time. The announcement's on the 12th. Thank you.
Anything else?
That's it.
Yes. Dennis, did you get it? Any other announcements from anybody? Here comes Dennis. You want to talk about Demigatti?
I started becoming familiar with Steve Wolborsky by watching him post things on Facebook. He was doing the macro, and also on a lot of different pages. and his stuff was really good. So I started following him, and I got in touch with him and asked him what was going on. I found out that he lived in Guam and that he's ex-military, and his wife MJ is also ex-military. We're not sure about his cat Ozzy or the other four that haven't been introduced to me yet, but I think that we're going to have a very interesting program. He's very much into macro and super macro, both for photos and video. He's a frequent poster to Facebook. And I think he's going to give us a great program today. So, Steven, hopefully if we keep our mouth right, you're online. If you can share.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep. Cool. Let me get into this. And okay. Can you guys see a map?
yes.
Okay, great. So half a day, as Dennis indicated, I'm Steve Wolborsky. My wife, Mary Jane, MJ, is with me. She's going to have to leave. She has an appointment she has to get to, but she wanted to at least be here for the introductory part. Now, you notice I said half a day. That is the local greeting in the Chamorro language. The indigenous people of Guam are called Chamorros, and their language is called Chamorro. So both the people and the language have the same name, and people get it wrong. They call them Chamorrans, Chamorrons, things like that. But that's what they're called. And we have been on Guam now for more than 20 years. It's a wonderful place to live. The military brought me here. I retired here. I had a whole second career in civil service here. And we probably will stay here for the rest of our lives. At least that's where we're at today. I wanted to give you just a few tidbits about Guam before I launch into the presentation on my feelings and my beliefs about macro photography and some technical information as well. But first of all, this is what the Pacific overall looks like. And there are some misconceptions about Guam. Now, there's probably some people in the audience who know really nothing about Guam. There's some who may have even been here. And there are many who are in between. Maybe you stopped at the airport on your way to somewhere else and so forth. And I think if you asked a typical American about Guam, there's probably about a 50% chance they would know it's a U.S. territory. And there's probably about a 10% chance that they would actually have some idea of where it is. They might say, oh, it's in the South Pacific, which is not correct. It's in the North Pacific. We're north of the equator. And they might say something like, well, I think it's near Hawaii. And what I will tell you is if by near you mean 3,750 miles from Honolulu, then yes, we are near Hawaii. In fact, if you go on Google, Hawaii is closer to Denver or Dallas than it is, and probably to Houston, than it is to Guam. So you get to Hawaii, you still got about an 8-hour flight in front of you to get to Guam. So we really are in the far western extremity of the U.S. And I show Guam on this map on the kind of in the upper left is Guam. We're our own political entity. We're a U.S. territory. North of us, there's another 13 islands that are called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. They're also U.S. Their political relationship with the United States is somewhat different than Guam's, and they're not politically the same as Guam. So we are not one unit with them. They have some famous places if you're familiar with World War II history. So two of their islands are Saipan, where there was a huge battle in June of 1944, and Tinian. If you know about the atomic bombs, well, they launched out of Northfield on Tinian, Enola Gay, and Boxcar in the two strikes against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So there's a lot of history tied up there, and they have their own thing, and that could be a subject for another day on diving. As you can see, we are close to a lot of probably well-known dive spots to you folks. We're less than an hour's flight from Yap. We're about the same distance from Truck Lagoon, which is now called Chuk, which is the more appropriate pronunciation. And both of those are states in the Federated States of Micronesia. And we're also a little over an hour by air from the Republic of Palau. So those are our kind of go-to places. Palau, if you're not familiar, has some of the world's greatest diving. A lot of diversity there. It's primarily focused, though, more on the wide angle, big stuff and beautiful reefs, walls, big stuff. And it's a wonderful place to go, and it's very easy for us to get to. I highly recommend, if you're going to go to any place out here, that would be the first place I think I would recommend you go. Now, if you're a macro, we have several other places. I have a large box around the Philippines. We go to Anilao. We go to Darwin, Dumaguete. We go to Puerto Galera, Malapascua. About half a dozen places there that we typically like to go to in the Philippines. And they're all kind of different. I can answer questions in the Q&A if you want opinions. We're also not that far, though it's a schlep by air to get to Lembe, which is on North Sulawesi. And then I just came back from Bali, and we spent 10 days there. Again, it's a schlep by air to get to a lot of these places. We used to have direct service from Guam to many of them, and no longer. So it takes about 20 hours or so for us to, even for us to get to a place like Bali. But once we're there, we're pretty well adjusted to the time zone. It's only a 2-hour difference, and we can get rocking and rolling. I do show the Great Barrier Reef because I just wanted to show that. A lot of people who are not familiar really with diving in general have this conception that it's this magnificent dive place. In the limited chance I had to go dive there, I was not overly impressed, but I do believe there's some good liveaboards out in the Coral Sea that will provide a great experience. So that's the big picture. Here's the more micro picture of our island, Guam. We're about 30 miles long by approximately 7 miles wide. You're never more than about four miles from the ocean anywhere on the island. So on the east side, it's technically the North Pacific Ocean, and the west side is technically the Philippine Sea. Same ocean, same water. On the north end of Guam, there's 2 large military bases. Anderson Air Force Base was built at the end of World War II to support B-29s and has been in operation ever since. I worked there again for 13 years, 2 years on active duty, and then 11 years in civil service. And then Camp Blas is the newest base. It's still under construction, but that's to house a contingent of Marines who are moving it. Big picture from Okinawa is reducing their forces, and they're increasing the force structure of Marines on Guam. So that's in work. It's been in work since 2006. So it's been a long time coming, and we're starting now to see the influx of Marines to that base. And then on the west side is Navy Base Guam. Navy Base Guam is sort of a great pivot point because all around it is where the best diving is on Guam. In general, most of our go-to dive sites are either in Apra Harbor or they're south of Navy Base Guam on the west coast, all the way down to Cocos Island on the end. The East Coast, much of the year when the trade winds are blowing, is kind of undivable because there aren't a lot of beach access, and where there is beach access, the seas can be pretty rough. So we don't do a lot of diving on the east side. The north, on the west, it's seasonal. So during the summer, again, the trades die down in June, July, August, and we'll do some trips that go up north, and those sites are pretty decent. Although in general, Guam's reefs are in relatively bad shape between coral bleaching and between poor land management and some other issues going on here. The island is not that great for big stuff, although there's a few marine preserves where you'll find turtles, sharks, rays. We have manas that come. Our main tourist area is called Tuman Bay, and it turns out that about twice a month, manas like to congregate there for cleaning and feeding and mating. So you can go out and snorkel with manas to your heart's content a couple of times a month, or right in the heart of the tourist area. Otherwise, what we've been doing, my wife and I have engaged in about the last 6 or 7 years in an ongoing pursuit of macro and super macro photography on Guam. And to our great surprise and delight, we have found through about 1,500 dives, 3 good sites. 2 are near the harbor, and one of them is down south near Cocos Island. And the one down south is actually the most fruitful. So I'm going to talk about that. That leads me into my subject, which I call, if you hear my cat, I call Macromaniac. And you can see one of my Costa Cielo photos in the background. And stealing from Shakespeare, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. the three main elements, and I'll go through each of these individually, are the thrill of the hunt, finding stuff, the capture, which is being able to image things appropriately, either stills or video, and then of course a creative process to follow when you're post-processing. So what you end up with, and hopefully the sound plays on this video, something that looks like this.
I don't know if you got the sound set up.
You do or you don't?
No sound. We didn't get the sound.
Okay, well, the sound's lovely. I love the song, but you can watch the video.
We'll take your word for it.
It's almost over. There you go. Okay, so that's a Circe nigra, butterfly, sea slug. They are really only about a max, about a quarter inch. So I know they look bigger and you think they're bigger, but they're not. We went to Romblon. I went with Mike Bardick and your speaker, Walter Marty. MJ and I went in January to Romblon with them, and that's their big thing there is we got this tiger butterfly slug, and lo and behold, we have them on Guam. And so it's kind of fun to photograph them and video them. But I'm going to go into each of these. Hunting. So the thrill of the hunt. First, yes, it's good to have a set of good eyes, and I was a pilot. I had good eyes. I don't have great far vision, but I have good near vision. And yet my eyes aren't that great, not compared to a 27-year-old Balinese kid who can find anything. But it's as much book work as it is eye work. And I've got Gosliner's book here as an example of a field guide, but studying field guides, studying resources, scientific papers, whatever you choose to go after, talking to others, talking to marine biologists, learn about these creatures. And it's just as much that knowing where to look to kind of narrow the search down. I mean, we're looking at, infinite numbers of virtually infinite grains of sand. That may not be very useful to you. So knowing kind of where to target your observation is very important in becoming a good critter spotter. You got to go slow. When I first started diving, I thought it was some kind of like speed race. I can remember one dive my wife and I went on. It was right after open water. We went down. We went to like 70 feet. 26 minutes, I was out of air. I had to go up. I had 500 PSI, time to go up. And man, she was mad. She said I was swimming like a scalded dog. So good macro, you got to go slow. And you got to almost get into like this Zen state where you're just going real slow and you're just really focused on the task at hand. With that, go low. I say there's not mathematically provable, but there's almost an inverse linear relationship between how low you are and how much you see. So if I cut my depth above the bottom in half, I see twice as many things. And you can see things inside of things, the lower you get. Now, with that, though, you have to have great buoyancy. You got to watch your fin tips. You got to watch all the stuff that's dragging off you, because you really don't want to go down there and you want to minimally destroy the environment. Let's be real. We're macro photographers. And every macro photographer I've ever met is a coral cruncher, but we try not to be. So that's the point. The point is try to be as conscientious and considerate as possible, because the goal is not to kill your subjects. The goal is to image your subjects, like this Costaciella usagi I have here on the screen. So I use a muck stick. It's a great tool. It's good for signaling. It's good for pointing things out. It's good for helping with a lot of things, but one of the main things I do is when I get low to the bottom is a lot of times I use my muck stick to pull myself along about a foot above the bottom or less. And that's how I propel myself. When I'm done shooting something, instead of just getting up and finning away and silting the place out, I stick my muck stick in the ground, I push on it, I push myself up several feet above the ground before I even think about moving my fins. So it's a very good technique, and all macro photographers should have a muck stick. Study the habits and habitat. And the details of that are things like, what do they eat? A lot of times these critters hang out at their local restaurant. So what do they eat? And go look at that and look for them. Do they hunt? Are they an ambush predator? Or do they actively go out and hunt and pursue things to eat? How and where do they mate? And I could go in a long, dissertation on all the sea slugs. The sea slugs are really, really interesting in their mating habits. They're like God's perfect mating machine. Are they nocturnal or are they diurnal? no point going out on a day dive looking for something that only comes out at night. So vice versa, have some goals in mind when you're going out on your dives. How do you handle current? So for macro photography, I always tell the guide, point me into the current when you're pointing stuff out. It's almost impossible, and is impossible, depending on the strength of the current, to shoot macro or super macro with a current. You cannot get a stable platform. But into a current, it's possible. You may have to anchor yourself with your muck stick. There's things you may have to do to get stable. But if it's a really strong current, then hey, enjoy the dive. Look at stuff. And it is fun sometimes to just dive and enjoy the dive without having to worry about photography. So the golden rules I apply for spotting and shooting, and you can see I was able to get a snooted photo of a hairy shrimp. I found the shrimp, so that was a plus for me. That I thought that was the holy grail till I started learning where to look and how to find them. And that was in Bali last year. But the big things here, my mantra is the pattern and the flow, the pattern and the flow. What breaks the pattern and the flow? Are you looking at a field of like brown algae when there's a white speck on it? Well, I'm going to look at that white speck or that orange dot. That's the thing I'm going to look at. What looks different? Is it moving? How is it moving? Oh, hey, it's moving. That's interesting. And if it moves with a purpose, even more interesting. There's always, always, always particulate in the water, no matter where you are. And the water's always moving, the water column. So if the particulate's going left and something you see is moving right, I bet it's a critter. So I'm going to wait for it to land, and then I can investigate and see what it is. And I usually will investigate. A lot of times I see it with my naked eye now. When I was starting, I have a magnifying viewfinder on my rig. But I also, of course, have the diopters that I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so I want to go through these in turn. This is a very quick review. This is the presentation I gave to the group in Houston was solely focused on critter spotting. So I'll give you the high points of it, but then we're going to move on and talk about some other things. So some people use a magnifying glass. I haven't found that very effective. I find my own equipment is more effective. And again, when I'm focused on pattern and flow, a lot of time my what we call our Mark I eyeballs are pretty good. So these are all the things I'm going to talk about in order. So bottles. Yeah, bottles are garbage and trash. And it's a shame that we trash our oceans, but the sea life will adapt. And this is where you find that sort of iconic octo in a bottle photo. And I've got here one from one of our local dive sites of a small octopus that was coming out. And then the other one, one day I flipped over a bottle. I like to flip them over, and I looked, and here's this nudibranch, a Phildiopsis cardinalis, which is one of the better looking of the bumpy, lumpy nudibranchs. Eggs. There's tons of eggs everywhere. Egg masses, either the balls or egg rings like nudibranchs lay, or egg bubbles. They're everywhere on the sites, and there's stuff on them. And like this Colpodospis thompsoni was a small brown dot on white eggs. I saw the dot. I looked, and hey, look at that. It's a little slug. And really interesting is the critters that eat eggs. So the Faverinus genus of nudibranchs are egg eaters. They eat other mollusks' eggs. This particular one is inside an egg mass. So they crawl up on the egg mass, they burrow their way in, and then they sit inside and eat it from the inside out. And to add insult to injury, a lot of times they lay their own eggs inside the egg mass. So we've got photos of egg masses on egg masses or inside egg masses, etc. But always look at eggs. There's always stuff to find there. Hydroids or hydrozoans, stinging animals that look like plants. This is where skeleton shrimp tend to hang out, one of the places they do. And there's whole species, genuses of nudibranchs that like to hang out and eat hydroids. That's why they are toxic. And you don't eat nudibranchs because a lot of them eat hydroids and have the toxin inside them. And this one picture is a eubranchus, but there's dodos, which are great. The donut nudie, Dodo greenmeyeri. There's a lot of great things to find on hydrozoans. So definitely investigate. Leaves. This is a favorite subject. On the left is the famous Avern Vallejo leaf. That is the leaf that Pastasiellas, Shaun the sheep, they eat it. They suck the sap. They're sap-sucking slugs. And what they do literally is walk around the leaf, suck the sap out, and they use a process similar to photosynthesis called kleptoplasty, where they're stealing chloroplasts from the algae, and they store it in their serrata for food source. So later on, when there is no algae, which they can very quickly kill, a group of Costacea can eliminate an algae in about a week. And they'll go in the ground and they'll stay there and live off what's stored up in their serrata till they can find another leaf. And then Halimeda is an ubiquitous algae in a lot of Pacific dive sites of different sizes, but there's often slugs or nudibranchs on there. There's Halimeda crabs that are decorator crabs and a lot of interesting stuff. So if you take the time to investigate. And then, of course, your hairy shrimp tend to hang out on algae, seagrass and algae. And they're not always easy to find, as I mentioned, but they're well worth the trouble if you can get a good photo of one. Now, I got a little example here. Can you spot the slug? And granted, it's not a very big picture, but it's not a very big slug. So circled in red on the bottom is, and I did this on purpose. This is obviously not an artistic photo, but I wanted to show that that's about a less than 1 inch leaf, and that's about a 2 millimeter slug. And that's the range in which I'm primarily working in most of my super macro, is in the 1 to 3, 1 to 4 millimeter range. Sea cucumbers, the buses, the city buses of the sea. There's always stuff on sea cucumbers. There's these little harlequin shrimp, which sometimes they take up residence in the anus of the sea cucumber. So if you see me staring at a sea cucumber's hole, well, that's what I'm looking for, is the crab. But in this case, this was in Lembe. The guide found this one, a Philodesmium nudibranch, on the sea slug. And then, of course, your emperor shrimp, who's opportunistic and will go on a sea cucumber, on nudibranchs, on anything that moves. And commensally, they will pick parasites off of the subject, but the subject will also take them around to other food sources. And they're very, very photogenic. So it's great to see them. Likewise, sea stars, not starfish, but they're sea stars, invertebrates. A lot of people say when they come to the Pacific, they go, "Ooh, I saw a blue starfish." And it's like, "Oh, yay, good for you. There's about 14 billion of them." So what I'm interested in, of course, is looking for what's on them. Is it a flatworm? Is it one of these commensal shrimp? Same genus as the emperor shrimp, but the soror tends to match the color of the host. So if it's a cushion star, it's yellow. The soror will be yellow or red, and you can get a photo of them. Likewise, the world famous ferocious harlequin shrimp. This one was about maybe 3 millimeters. This is a baby, and it's having a dinner on an orange sea star. They're so vicious, a lot of times they will eat the arm off a sea star, wait till it grows back and eat it again. So not only are they photogenic, but they're ferocious. And I thank God every day that they're not like my size, because they would definitely be worse than like alien. Sponges. Sponges, again, provide habitat for a lot of critters. Frogfish. Frogfish love sponges. They use them for camouflage, so because they're ambush predators. So they'll sit there and an unsuspecting fish will swim up and get ate by the frogfish. And also nudibranchs. A lot of nudibranchs eat sponges, particularly like these black finger sponges that we have all over our dive sites. The Glossodoris nudibranchs like them. And here I got sort of the triple crown. You know, I got the nudibranch that's pretty, that's eating a sponge with a shrimp on it. By the way, that is the only nudibranch with a shrimp I've ever found on Guam. So I share it with you. Sticks. Random stuff in the water that sticks up. We found on one of our sites, lo and behold, we found pygmy squid. There's a time of the year that there are a lot of pygmy squid out at this site. So MJ spent the better part of like 6 weeks. Every time she found a piece of wood or something sitting on the bottom, she'd stand it upright. And pretty soon we'd have about 10 places we could go, or 12 places we could go and look for pygmy squids. And that particular photo has 2 of them in it. The Baolidia moebi, they tend to be on driftwood or leaves. So I look at leaves. I pick up like leaves from trees that end up in the ocean. I pick them up. I shake them gently. If you shake it gently, guess what? The sand falls off and the mollusks and slugs stick to it. So it's a quick way to sort the mollusk or the slug from the sand and dirt. Tunicates, your sea squirts, also animals. I'm sure all of you know, looking around the room, I don't think there's too many newbies here, but if you don't know, they're animals as well. Another place where you'll find skeleton shrimp. I love skeleton shrimp. I love making videos of them too. And when they give birth, the babies stick all over the parent. It's just, some of them are way more insane than this one. And they're just constant movement, especially at night. Oh, and they're also ferocious. So they're very cool photo subject. And then, of course, here's a nudibranch, a Goniobranchus, that's by a tunicate. And the photo on the left is from Porto Galera in the Philippines. The one on the right is from Guam. Under and backside of corals. I can't tell you how many times I've gone over or past a coral and just stopped and turned around and looked, and lo and behold, there's something cool that I just would have otherwise gone by, but I looked backwards. Some of the things we find, of course, eels live in and around coral heads, but cardinal fish. Almost every species of cardinal fish that I have ever seen has the same characteristic of the males mouth brooding the eggs. This includes the Bangai cardinal fish in Lembe. I've got photos of that with eggs in its mouth. And these are yellow cardinal fish that's in that left photo there. It's about 1.5 inches long fish. And we can tell now from sight the male with a distended jaw. It's once you get used to it, it's easy to find them. And they're usually in couples. There's usually a female that's laid the eggs, that's the guardian. Somebody got a photo, won a big award of the actual passage of the eggs from the female to male. I hate that person. But that's what happens. The female passes the eggs to the male puts the eggs in its mouth, and it sits there and broods them for about, think it's about 7 to 10 days as the eggs mature. When they start out, they're usually like a bright orange. They're full of yolk. As the embryo develops and the yolk is consumed, you start to see more development. And in this one, it's about midway, and you can see the eyes. The fish will aerate the eggs frequently. He does not eat while he has the eggs in his mouth. And about every 3 to 5 minutes, they do this rotation of the egg mass. And I've got it in slow motion on a video, one of my videos. He shakes his head violently. You cannot see it with the naked eye. And even on 10% speed, it's very fast. He shakes his head to shake it loose. He distends his jaw, he opens it wide, and then he rotates the egg mass. And that's where you get those really fabulous photos of fish with their mouth full of eggs. And on the right is my good friend, I call him Cheeseball, the juvenile yellow boxfish, Austrasian cubicum. And when they're small, they're really, really cute. They may be 1/2 inch or less in diameter. They have a hexagonal like pattern on their skin. And it's great to get you got to be patient. If you're patient and wait, eventually it's going to turn and face you. So have your everything locked up, have your focus locked, ready to go. And when it turns towards you, bang, get your shot. Okay, so once you find the subject, now what am I going to do? I'm going to capture it. So these are wholly biased criteria that I tend to use for photos that I like to take, I like to post or even sell, and that I encourage others when I teach them to do. Find something interesting, find it doing something interesting, and capture it in a technically accurate way or an artistic way, which is kind of the next step. So what do I mean? What's an interesting subject? Well, that is subjective. I have my interest, and most of you have your interests, and they may not intersect, but I will tell you based on many, many hours of looking at websites, at people's websites, seeing what people sell, watching stuff on TV or video, and looking at social media. These are interesting. Nudibranchs are almost always interesting. The bumpy ones, sometimes not so much. Slugs of all kinds, generally so. Some shrimp, some crabs, anemone fish, of course, particularly your clownfish or your false clownfish. Any kind of juvenile fish, typically interesting, especially if they look way different than the adult. Any kind of spiky, spiny, sticky, nasty fish, frogfish, scorpionfish, stonefish. Octopus are almost always interesting, and most eels. Less so. Most sea stars by themselves, most fish, because they're generally not cooperative unless you like fish ass photos. Corals, tunicates, algae by themselves. Although I tell you, I have taught a lot of women photographers, and I'm not a misogynist. I think there's just differences between men and women. Maybe it's a right brain, left brain thing, but a lot of times women can see patterns and things that I think the guys don't always see. And I've seen some really beautiful pictures of like corals with really beautiful patterns on it. So don't discount it, but in terms of kind of starting out and, you know, you go on 2 dive vacations a year, you're probably not going to spend a lot of your time looking at coral by itself. All right, so second thing, it's doing something interesting. And again, that's a completely subjective judgment, but I would say things like they're mating, that's interesting, they're eating. And honestly, let's be real, if it's predation, if they're eating another creature, it's terrible, it's traumatic, and it's really an interesting photo when you see that lizard fish with another fish in its mouth. So yeah, it makes for a good photo. I don't encourage it. I don't bait my targets with stuff. That's horrible. But if I see it, I'm going to shoot it. Aggressive, mouth brooding, aerating. If they're with or on another species, that's your emperor shrimp, or posing in a particularly interesting way. That's the nudibranch photo with the rearing up or a real, close up. And I'll talk to that in a minute. And what do I want to get? This is what I teach people. If you have a choice, how do you want to approach your subject and shoot it? Well, basically you want a head or front shot is the shot you most desire. With the eyes, or if it's rhinopores or similar type appendages in focus, where's the eye going to get drawn to? Have that in focus. Human eyes are drawn to eyes. I think that's why people like Shaun the Sheep, because it's got eyes. It's got a cute little face. Even if the eyes aren't particularly functional and the rhinopores are the real sensory organ, it resonates with people. So try to shoot from the front, and we'll talk depth of field in a minute. If you can't get the front, get the side, and maybe get the animal in a half side, half front, whatever aspect you can get. And if you just can't get any of that, well, shoot top down. And sometimes a top-down photo can be absolutely beautiful. A turtle with a beautiful carapace, for example, not a macro photo, but there are other animals that look beautiful from the top down. So there's always exceptions to the rule. One main exception is if you're not sure what it is, you ought to get photos from as many angles as possible so you can throw it out on the website and people like Linda can tell you that, what it is. Or this guy named Ron Silver who seems to know what everything is. So if you're shooting for a field guides don't have a lot of beautiful photos in them necessarily. They have informative photos that show you the animal so you can identify it yourself. All right, so the third criterion, capture this in a technically accurate or artistic way. And this is now treading into maybe a little bit more of the science of photography versus the art. Get close. We heard this all the time, right? If you think you're close enough, get closer. That's true in wide angle, but I will tell you in macro, there is a too close. Unless you want, for some artistic reason, to photograph the tip of a rhinopore, you're generally going to want to get more of the animal. So you want to get composed with your fins and get yourself into a shooting position vis-a-vis the subject that lets you compose the photo you want to capture, not the photo that necessarily that the subject presents to you when you first see it. Shoot up, or at least level. Now in wide angle, again, you almost always want to get below and shoot up, but in macro, you can't always. If your subject's on the ground, how am I going to shoot up? Well, you can try to get level with the subject. Sometimes it's not possible. I shoot video with a tripod, and in most cases, I'm shooting down at least a little bit on most of my shots. It's not physically possible without doing something stupid or wrong, like moving the animal or something like that. So I kind of have my own ethical limits on what exactly I'll do. But I will put my camera down with the tripod down. I will do that. Composing in camera. If you have some cameras, not possible. You really can't move your focus point around. There's not much you can do. A lot of more advanced cameras have a movable focus point, what we borrow this from fighter pilots. We call it a pipper. And you move the pipper around and you compose the photo you want, then you move the pipper to the part you want to focus on. So you want to maybe put the nudity bank on the right third or the left third or the subject on the top or the bottom third, whatever it is, to avoid what I consider to be the generally terrible photo, which is the tiny subject in the smack middle of your image. So you want to do as much composition in camera as you can, but sometimes you hit a limit. The subject's too, like these Costa Ciellas, they're too small. So I have to compose and post. Okay, we'll talk some definitions. I have my diagram here. People talk about macro when they're shooting smaller critters. They say, that's macro. Well, what is macro? Technically, it is a one-to-one magnification of the subject to the sensor. If your subject is 6 millimeters, then it will be 6 millimeters on your sensor when you're at the minimum focus distance for a dedicated macro lens. Not every lens, in fact, most lenses won't let you get one-to-one magnification. Most lenses will not let you get that close, will not let you get that magnification. So a macro lens will let you get one-to-one magnification when you are at the minimum focus distance, which, by the way, you can look on your camera. There's like a theta symbol. There's a symbol on top of your camera body that shows you where the focal plane is on the sensor. And it's technically measured from that. That's not very practical when I'm underwater with a lens on my camera, with a housing on my camera, with a port on my lens, and a diopter on. So knowing that it's 11 inches from the sensor is not very helpful, but I'll give you a hint that for most of these macro lenses, it's somewhere around 4 to 6 inches or so from the end of the port is a good place to start and see if you can achieve focus. And that's the minimum focus distance. So that's an important thing to understand. Compact cameras, another thing you may not be aware of if you're shooting with like an RX100 or LX100. I'll talk about TGs in a minute, but most of those will require a wet diopter to achieve macro one-to-one. If you don't know what I mean by a compact camera, that's a camera that has an unattachable lens. The lens is attached to the camera, it zooms in and out, and you cannot remove it or exchange it for another lens. I think everybody here probably knows that. Super macro, technically, is any magnification greater than 1-to-1. And there's multiple ways to achieve it, at least 3 ways I know of. The first one is there are dedicated super macro lenses on the market. One of them that's new, that's interesting, is made by OM Systems, the company formerly known as Olympus, and they've come out with a 90 millimeter macro pro lens that is a 2-to-1 at its min focus distance. So interesting. I haven't seen a lot about how it works with wet diopters and other stuff, but you can get 2-to-1. Some of the really expensive Nauticam, fancy macro wide stuff will do 2-to-1 with your macro lens close in, and it'll do like 160 degrees wide behind. So if you got a spare $6 or $8 grand you want to spend, just buy me one. It's a joke. A dry option is to attach a teleconverter or an extension tube between your camera body and your lens. Yeah. The problem for me with teleconverters or extension tubes is they limit your flexibility. You're stuck with whatever they give you for the whole dive. You cannot change. So if you know you're going in and that's what you're going to shoot, then shoot. And I find it's extremely difficult to get those things to work with a wet diopter on the outside as well. So I think from my perspective and from my experience, which is not great with these things, it gives you what you're going to get, and that's what you're going to get, and you can't change what you're going to get for the whole dive. It also reduces the light, so you have to take other measures to compensate for your exposure when using a teleconverter or an extension tube. The third option is a wet diopter or some kind of magnifying lens. That gives you, to my mind, the maximum flexibility that if I have a macro lens attached with a flip diopter, I can do macro, super macro, and multiple levels of super macro, and very quickly switch from one to the other. So for me, that's a sweet spot. Plus, when I shoot stills, I shoot my stills with a Nikon D850. I can flip to DX mode, so I have a crop sensor mode. So basically, I have like 6 levels of options if I'm carrying 2 wet diopters of how I want to compose and how I want to capture my picture. If you think you need more than 6, then let me know. And tell me how you do it, because 6 is a lot.
Steve, could I ask a question?
Sure
Do
can.
you do the double flip?
Yes. I do.
So to
And
clarify, Steven, you do 2 diopters.
I carry 2 diopters on a double flip holder with my still camera.
Don't stack
I
them.
have-
You
Yeah,
don't
I have the
stack
Nauticam. For my video rig, a GH5S, I have a Nauticam, and I use a Nauticam bayonets, which I don't really like, by the way. I'd much rather have a flip, but I just haven't bought it yet. But the flip holder, to me, my wife and I both have AOI flip holders. I find it's a good product at a good price that works really well. Let me touch a minute here on the TG7 or TG6, or now the TG7. That's a bit of an exception to the rule of compact cameras, because they advertise, OM, that they can get 4:1 magnification at their minimum focus distance, which is about 1 centimeter, less than half an inch. Very few TG photographers get that close, and most of them cannot get a light on the subject that close. And I know there's a guy on social media who shoots with a TG4 in microscope mode and a small torch. And he goes, "This is all you need." And it's like, I don't want to insult the guy. I don't like to get involved in social media battles, but it's all you need if that's the subjects you're going to go for. But if you're going to go for anything else, you're going to have more rig. And
Yeah, Steve,
but
Steve, I have another.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I had a
Go
question about the TG7. I've seen it in operation, and yeah, they do have to worry about how to get light on the subject. But is that a digital zoom, or is that an actual optical zoom?
It's an optical zoom, and you zoom all the way in with the lens, and then you get to the min focus distance to get that magnification. I think they have an 8 times or something else that they advertise for digital. I never use digital zoom. Image quality is dog crap, so I don't use it, and other people may have a different opinion. But yeah, the TG, so to my mind, the TG, I personally have one. I have one. I've shot a lot with it. I've taught a lot of people with it. I am not particularly enamored with the super macro photographs on the TG. I think interchangeable lens camera with diopters gets much better image quality. But you can use, I'll talk in a minute about some add-ins, some plugins for noise reduction and sharpening that really help that out. What I am impressed with the TG is I ended up flooding my 850 in Romblon on the first target of the first dive on the first day. Talk about a crap sandwich. But I was able to rent a TG6, and I used it the whole rest of the vacation and just did video. So I used my tripod, my lights, and I was really impressed, honestly, with the video that camera produces, for the lack of complexity, for the compactness. It's a nice video camera. And I also actually am fairly impressed with the wide angle you get with the wet lens, which is almost as expensive as the camera itself. The wet lens that backscatter AOI makes it. I like the image quality of the wide angle with proper lighting is pretty good. So wet diopters. So this is where I'm going to emphasize, and I know Dennis has mentioned my cat, Ozzy. Ozzy's 1,000 times magnification. But here I've laid out, and you can see they're well used, some of my gear. But you need to understand what the numbers mean. So a +5 diopter, that's not very meaningful to a photographer, but 1.4 times magnification is meaningful. +10 is 2 times magnification. +12.5, that's the Nauticam SMC1. #1 recommended best choice, in my opinion. 2.4 times. +15, 3 times. And then the beast, the behemoth, the monster, the SMC2, +23.5 and 4 times. And I will tell you that some manufacturers, Nauticam is very good, wonderful, love it, expensive. If you want less expensive alternatives, I would highly recommend, in those ranges, I would highly recommend AOI. My wife shoots with their 23.5, or Kraken. And I have a Kraken 23.5, which is a hefty piece of glass, but it's half the price of the Nauticam. and pretty good image quality. So what diopters? This is how you get to macro or super macro outside of a TG or similar camera. Well, how do they do it?
One thing, Steven, that there's a learning curve in terms of grab and focus using diopter.
I'm gonna talk to that. Thank you, Justin. I'm gonna talk to that in just 1 second. You are so right.
Oh my God.
Yes, they reduce the minimum focus distance to let you get greater than 1:1.
Yeah.
So you get to focus closer, but guess what? The stronger the diopter, the closer you can get. So far, so good. But now I'm going to talk to what you just said. They don't focus to infinity. Your macro lens will focus technically to infinity. So I don't have to be at min focus distance to acquire the focus. I can be anywhere behind it. And as long as the lens can see it, you can focus. Not so with these bad boys. The stronger they are, the harder they are to use. The narrower the delta between the minimum focus and the maximum focus. So when I first started shooting macro, and I made my wife do the same thing, we spent a lot of time on the bottom and about 30 feet of water trying to photograph the little shrimp with the goby and trying to get it that the goby didn't go in, that the shrimp came out. And if you're not familiar, I can explain later what that is, but we were trying to shoot those and trying to get close, and you get to macro, and it would go away. And then I put an SMC1. I got one. I said, oh, people love this thing. I'm going to use it. And it was impossible. I could not do it until I could do it. After a lot of practice, I was able to figure out, oh, geez, I can't put this camera anywhere I want. I only have about 1 inch to work with. And then I started to get good photos, and I started to get proud of myself. I said, well, SMC2, they advertise that as pro gear. I'm kind of pro, aren't I? No, that was worse. I took that out in like the first month, and I got it as a gift. So somebody I taught gave it to me as a present because I do my teaching. I used to be a PADI instructor. I quit doing that. I teach for free. And she got me this as a gift, and I put it on my camera. And I went, I'll do this. And I went, no, I won't. And it was a lot of shooting, and I went away from it, and then I came back to it with a lot more patience, and I was able to use it. And now it's my go-to. I use it all the time. I use it for my videos. I probably use the SMC2 at home. I use it almost, I've gone whole dives where that's the only lens I've used the whole time is the SMC2. When I go on vacation, I tend to use the SMC1 because it's more flexible. It'll buy me a larger range of creatures to shoot. So I tend to use the medium range diopter versus the super close-up diopter. But when you're doing all this, it's really, really easy if you're not careful to run into the subject or to run into the habitat of the subject. So you really need to be careful. The way I do it is I always start out where I can't even focus and slowly move my way in. And now, it's like muscle memory. Now I know about where to start for each of these diopters, where I'm going to start to look. And what I'll do is I'll look at the scene first, and I'll say, oh, look, there's a yellow tunicate right there. And the thing I'm looking at is just to the left of the yellow tunicate. So if I can't find the thing, which a lot of times you see it, and then Blackwater. Blackwater is the worst. And I know Linda could verify this, but Blackwater, I'm looking, see the thing. I put the camera up to my face. I see nothing, or all I see is backscatter. So we have techniques, different presentation that we use to do Blackwater, but it's the same thing. The subject disappears. So get the context, get the overall context, and be careful. Okay, aperture. This is a little bit tutorial. I'll run through it pretty fast because I think most of you know all this stuff. Aperture is also known as the f-stop. It controls two things. It controls the exposure, how much light can actually get to your sensor, and it also controls the depth of field, how much of the frame is in focus and how deep. If you look at your frame as an infinite series of planes, one behind the other, how many of those planes are in focus and in what range? The f-stop to aperture relationship, this is one of the hardest things to talk to people about at the start. Smaller number, bigger hole, less depth of field. Bigger number, smaller hole, more depth of field. it could be like a mantra. You know, you can go, and talk about the size of the hole and et cetera. But it's useful to understand that from a rope perspective. It's better, of course, to understand it from an operational standpoint where you're actually doing it and see the effects. But it's important at the start to kind of know what those things mean. Otherwise, you get lost in the jargon. What is the depth of field? It's controlled by two factors. I just mentioned the aperture controls depth of field, but also the distance from the subject does. The closer you are to a subject, the less depth of field you're going to have. The less of it's going to be in focus. That's why when you're shooting with and again, photographers confuse the crap out of this. They go, that's a really fast lens, f1.2. Well, wait, f isn't fat. Yeah, it is. Okay, because with a wide aperture, I can have a higher shutter speed, so it's faster, right? But it's like they intentionally make this subject more confusing than it needs to be. The closer you get, the less depth of field. If you want to keep the depth of field, you got to shut the aperture down. So that's the way the relationships work. Smaller aperture, more depth of field. Bigger aperture, less depth of field. Closer to subject, less depth of field. Farther away, more depth of field. That's how it works. And this is an example. So I shot this emperor shrimp on a sea cucumber at f29. And then I shot the same subject at f11. And now you can see only a little bit. And I got the bit in that I wanted in, which was the eyes. So I got the eyes in focus, and everything else is varying degrees of blurry bokeh. All right, ISO. It controls the sensitivity of the sensor. If your camera has a native ISO or dual native ISO, you'll want to adhere to that. That's particularly good in video. And basically what it means is there's these inflection points on the curve of noise curve where the noise is minimized. So like my camera, it's has dual native, my video camera has dual native ISO at 400 and 2500. And you want to set your ISO to 400 or 2500 because you're going to get your least noisy photo with that. And if you're shooting in log 800 and 5000, too confusing, don't care. Most of the time, the rule of thumb in underwater photography, particularly stills, is go with about the lowest ISO your camera offers. That's going to probably be your best bet when you're shooting with external light. And that's the relationship to noise. The higher the ISO, the more light it'll gather, so that you can shoot in lower light, but the more noise you're going to generate. Noise being that fuzzy, pixely looking stuff. And like I say, sat or near lowest on the camera. Typically, I don't do a lot of messing with the ISO. I have a camera bank of settings I use for wide angle. I have a bank setting I use for macro and super macro. I have a bank setting I use for shooting with a torch. And my fourth bank setting is for blackwater. And all of them have an ISO associated, and I generally don't change it much. And I don't use auto ISO for when I have external light illuminating my subject. There are circumstances where auto ISO would be great to have. If you're interested, I can answer that. Great to use in the Q&A, but it's a wide angle scenario. All right, shutter speed. Again, it controls the exposure, but it also controls the background, how light or dark it is or what color it is. You want that black background, set it to your flash sync speed, usually 1/200 or 1/250. Some cameras will let you do high speed sync. And if you have an electronic shutter or mechanical, there are a lot of options out there. Don't complicate it. Set it to flash sync speed and start there. And then you can experiment later. Get a lot of water between you or beyond the subject. If you're shooting against the water, guess what? It goes to infinity basically. And you're going to get with a high shutter speed, you're going to get a black background. And you don't need a snoot or anything. You can just do it like that. Blue or bright, slower shutter speed, like this octopus. And the old rule of thumb was 1 over the focal length, don't go any slower than that. So if you're shooting with a 105, there is no 105 setting, but a lot of cameras have a 1/100 or 1/125. So usually you don't want to be slower than 1/125, but nowadays a lot of cameras have in-body image stabilization, or you have vibration, whatever it is. I knew what it was, and now I've had a 66-year-old brain fart, but VR, vibration reduction. And those things will let you actually go to slower shutter speed without shake or without blur. But nevertheless, 1 over the lens focal length is still a good rule of thumb to get the photo you want and not have blur. And then motion blur. This is something I will tell you I kind of suck at. I'm not very good at this. Mike Bardick, he challenged us to go do this, and I went out and my pictures were terrible. But I did get this juvenile Harlequin sweet lips in Palau, and I got a little bit of motion blur in the back, but I had to go way slower than I went to like 1/4 second or something like that. And the trick is to get the motion, but keep the eye in focus. So have fun. Lighting, you guys, I heard there's a lighting seminar or something. That's pretty cool. Let me talk a little bit about it. There's basically there's 3 types. There's natural light, which if you're doing macro, it's kind of hard to do unless your subject's really close to the surface. So it's really, really difficult to do natural light macro. So I'm just going to limit the discussion here to strobes or constant lighting. Strobes, we use them for stills. That's what they're good for. An intense amount of light in a very short amount of time to illuminate your subject while not necessarily illuminating the whole frame, depending on what you're doing. You can do constant lighting, will let you do video, and you can do stills with constant lighting. And I showed a guy this week, he was distraught. He's a military guy stationed in Korea, went on our Bali trip, met us there. He says, I really screwed up. I forgot my flash trigger. And I said, you got your lights? Yeah. I said, you're going to be shooting. And I showed him how to set his ISO to 800, and I showed him what settings, and he went out and got some good photos, super macro and macro. So guess what? His vacation wasn't ruined. But if you have strobes, generally preferable. And this is the first thing I tell people to adjust. First of all, I tell them always understand what your histogram is, understand how to read it, and have it up on your review. And have your review up for about 10 seconds after you shoot. So you don't have to go hunting for things. You shoot and you look at it and have the panel up that has either histogram, one or all of them, the RBGs. But if you're shooting in RAW, just look at the white one. If it's too far to the left, you're probably too dark. If it's too far to the right, you're probably too bright. And then adjust your lighting first accordingly, either the position or the intensity of the lights. And that's if you're in manual. I heard somebody mention TTL. Personally, tried it, don't like it. Not gonna do it. But if you want to do it, it's available to you. And I've seen people get great results with TTL. Like David Fleetum, he's pro, been a pro forever. Dive with him. He uses TTL. Good. He likes it. It works for him. But if you're doing TTL, unless you have, the Ike used to have a housing that had EV adjustments on the back, which was really, really, the one good feature of that housing for me, not trashing a manufacturer, but for my uses, was that little EV dial on the back, because if it was too bright, I could dial it down 1/3 of an EV or whatever. And that was really useful to calibrate it. But most of them don't have that. So the only option I see for TTL is to move the strobes to a different position. The best article I found on this is this one on Backscatter's website. Jim Decker wrote it. It's a really, really good article with diagrams based on what you have and what you want to achieve, where to put your lights. Now, special subject, the snoot. I think most of this audience would probably knows what a snoot is and have used them. And it's a bit faddish to me, some of it. So there's lots of snoots on the market. I have had some. I challenge anybody to have a big honkin' Aquatica housing with a big honkin' DS161 Ike-like strobe with a big honkin' Retro LSD on it and achieve any kind of photo whatsoever. I tried. I can't. So when Backscatter came out with the MF1, originally now the MF2 with the OS1 snoot, that was a game changer for me and probably for a lot of people. That brought snooting kind of into the mainstream for a lot of shooters. And it's got its uses and its applicability, but it shapes the light that comes off of either the light source, a constant light source, or the strobe. It's a special case. I already said that. How do you position it? There's multiple ways. One of them gives this photo. This is the first one on the right of the Costa Cielo. That's what I call the circus ring. And that's where you put the snoot on the strobe, out in front of the camera, pointed down vertically, and align it at the correct distance from your end of your port to get the photo. Again, the stronger the diopter, the harder it is. And I took that one with the SMC too, so you can pat me on the back later, but I practiced that, and so I got it that way. A lot of times what I'll do with these photos though is I'll actually take the snoot off. I'll take it off the arm. I'll put it on either on the ground or like on one of those backscatter muck stick things, and I'll adjust the aperture to where it's the exact correct distance so the beam is not split, and I'll point it at the subject, and it's actually vertically faced, but I will flip it in post. So I'll illuminate it when it's faced vertically. I'll go to the side of the leaf. I'll take the photo. When I get home, I'll flip it 90 degrees and voila, which is what I think I did here. But for me, I like to have my snooting a little more accurate. And so like the photo on the left, and whether you like it or not, and people have their own opinions about colorization and gels and so forth, I just decided, hey, you know what? I'll take my torch, I'll put a gel on it, I'll illuminate the top of the bottle, and I'll use a snoot to get the octopus inside. And it all was predicated on actually finding an octopus inside, because I thought about this before the dive. I did, and I was able to get the photo, and I snooted just what I wanted to snoot, and I colorized just what I wanted to colorize. So to me, holding your snoot level or putting it on a stick or holding it in your hand, especially with this backscatter stuff, is, to me, gives you a more interesting and better photo than the circus ring. White balance, shooting raw, period. 4 exclamation points. If you're shooting raw, you really don't need to worry about this. You know, the courses that say, take a white or gray slate down and do a manual, man, that is a lot of work and you missed the subject already. But to me, if you do that and you can do it well and you're trained in it and it's good, right on, go for it. It's a great technique. But I shoot in raw. And I find that in a lot of scenarios, especially with the less expensive camera, auto white balance is perfectly fine with external lighting. It works great on wide angle. I do auto white balance, warm colors, keep warm colors, and rock and roll. I hardly have to tweak anything in post. And if I do find, and particularly with macro, if I find that I'm constantly setting my color temperature to a certain Kelvin and my tint to a certain red or green or whatever way it's going to those settings, I'll go into the camera and I'll actually set the Kelvin temperature, and I'll set the tint. I'll bias it towards like magenta and set the Kelvin temperature I typically end up with in Lightroom, and use that as my white balance. And that works fantastic for macro. It saves a lot of time in processing, and any time I can save is good time. Creating. I'm not going to talk much here, so I'm almost done, folks. Software. Here's my main contention. Use that. Don't use that. No. It doesn't take long to learn how to use Lightroom Classic. If you don't know how to use it, there's a lady named Erin Quigley. She's a great photographer. She's a great teacher. She runs dive trips. She'll teach you Lightroom Classic. You may have to pay, go ask Erin, but it's worth it. Even Adobe has good information. I typically take almost only about an hour and a half. And what I teach people to do is, here's how Lightroom handles your raw photos and where you need to put them and what a catalog is. And here's how the basic processing steps and what a workflow looks like. And here's how you export. And in an hour and a half, I can typically take people from ground speed 0 to about 30, 45 miles an hour. I don't talk about masks. I don't talk about hue, saturation, and luminance. I don't talk a lot of that stuff, but I get them to where they're processing their own photos, and then we grow from there. So some tips, real simple. I use crop guide overlays to compose. I use the golden ratio. That's the crop guide overlay I use most. And I like to line things up on that. And some people use a golden spiral. I think those are the two most useful. And the rule of thirds is the next most useful. But if you don't know what they are, look it up. Crop guide overlay when you use your cropping in your workflow. Plugins. There's a lot of plugins. I like the Topaz products. The Topaz Photo AI is sort of their newest one. But honestly, for my purposes, the old Denoise AI seems to work quicker, works better for my needs. The thing is, don't overdo it. Slow your roll on the sharpening. There's a lot of people out there that are like wicked over processing their photos, in my opinion. You kind of lose, should be a little bit, to me, a really good macro photo has to have a little bit of softness to it. And you want sharp, what should be sharp, but not like so sharp that it doesn't look like a real creature. So they go full right on the sharpness, and then they go back into Lightroom and full right on the texture. And look at this, it's a fantastic, right? And it's like, okay, well, some people like it, I don't. So that's my opinion, obviously. But I use the Topaz products and I don't overdo it. I have a watermark. My handwriting is dog crap. So unless you have really great handwriting and you're really good at graphics, like Photoshop, I use Photo Logo, $45. And I got a logo made that I really like. So, yeah, this is kind of up to you, but you should watermark or somehow safeguard your work as best as you can, knowing that people can remove it. They can steal your stuff. People do steal your stuff. So if you get agitated about that, you're probably in the right hobby. I make double backups of my work. I save everything on my hard drive, and then I save it to a portable, removable hard drive. And then I have a second master drive because we have one. My wife's doing stills now, and I'm doing mostly video. So a lot of detail there, Q&A stuff. A little bit, one slide, I think is all I have on video. Use a tripod for macro. I don't care who you are. I was an Air Force pilot, and my hands are not good enough to manually hold my camera and shoot super macro. I cannot do it. When you're dealing with millimeters, you got to have a tripod. And video is about movement. So subjects that are interesting, like I talked about, or uninteresting, maybe reversed. Here's an example, hermit crabs. I don't take a lot of photos of hermit crabs. I'm not interested terribly in them. But I do take video of them because I think they're interesting. They move their eyes around. They eat out of the sand. They're doing a lot. They're busy. And if there's a lot of busyness, it's probably a good video subject. So Walter taught me this. Walter Marty is going to be your speaker. He says, video is about movement. Yeah, I guess so. If the thing's not moving, why video it? And it is wickedly more complicated than still photography. If you really want to do it well, it can be very complicated. I do have a whole separate presentation, if anybody's interested, on a future date, that I created that's kind of a video 101 that cuts through a lot of the jargon about bit rates and chromas and codecs. Got it. If you want to know, I think it's pretty simple. I tried it out on a few people that didn't know anything about video, and they said, yeah, okay, I get it. So anyways. And yes, same reason, it's memory intensive. If you're shooting 60 frames per second at 4K, that's like 60, I forget, I did the math, but it's like 8 megapixel photos every second. That's a lot of memory. Okay. Oh, wow, that's a real great photo, Steve.
Yeah, I got one of those.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Let's see
And
who all's on here. Okay.
I was also
Yeah, we're going to have to close it up pretty quickly, but go ahead, Justin.
Yeah. So I also shoot a D850. I've got the SMC1, I think. And I will be friends with anybody who can pull off a good snoot shot with an SMC. Like, you're my friend. Like, we're good.
Yeah, I'll find you on Facebook.
You just have to be friends with the dive guides, right?
That's the thing too, but there's some places I've gone where I have nobody to hold the snoot, and I want to get this subject, and I also have a backscatter MF1. And boy, I tell you what, when you nail it, you nail it. But it is standing on a bowling ball in high heels.
Yeah, we can have an offline, conversation or chat about this technique of taking it off the housing, off the
Yeah.
arm. That's
And then
a really, go
the
ahead.
other interesting thing is, so I've been toying with the idea of getting another rig just for video because there's this guy, Dennis, he's part of HUPS. He gets me into video now. So now I'm hooked on video. And my D850 is just, it's a little too much to get video. It's just, it's a Ferrari, in a toddler race. So,
Yeah.
it's interesting that you use that GH, and I was kind of looking at housings in my spare time and seeing like, what I already travel with enough gear. What's the smallest housing I can get that gives me the most bang for buck to do some awesome video? Because I struggle with the D850. It goes out of focus. Yeah. It's like it's so sharp that you miss a point, that thing moves out of focus.
So
Get a
I'll talk to D850 briefly, and then I'll talk to why I have another rig. So the D850 is, first of all, the camera came out in 2017. So we're talking about a 7-year-old design. I will argue that as far as still photography goes, the autofocus system, particularly the autofocus continuous 3D mode, is probably, I haven't shot every camera in the world, so I'm making an opinion based not on complete facts. But in my opinion, the best autofocus for still photography ever created. It's unbelievable. It's so good.
Yeah.
It is really good. And the rare instances where it doesn't work, I'll flip over to AFS and lock on to the thing I want to focus on, and that works. But almost 99% of the time, 3D is the mode. On the other hand, the D850, the mode you have to use for video, because in video you have to use live view. You cannot use your viewfinder. You have to switch to live view for video. Is you either have AFS or AFF full time, and AFF is bad in my opinion for underwater video. It's bad. It doesn't work. I'd rather, frankly, just manual focus than try to use that with my macro lens. Or you keep it locked on. If you're lucky, you keep it locked on. I just went to Bali. I took my 850. I didn't take my video rig. And I said, you know what? I'm going to do video with the 850. It'll do 4K, but it'll only do 4K 30. And I want to do at least 60. And so it'll do 1080 60 at a fairly low bit rate for color. And it doesn't have log. So I'm using what's called a flat profile. But the worst part is in 4K, it doesn't do focus peaking. So I can't tell where my focus is at. And I didn't have a monitor.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, shoot. That makes a lot of sense because I shoot in 4K and I really couldn't, again, the focus is what irritates me the most.
Yep. If you want to use the 850 for video, shoot at 1080 60, underwater video, 1080 60. And put your focus peaking on red color and on high level. And you'll be able to at least find what's in focus.
I'll find you.
As fascinating as I am with this, I think we're gonna have to cut it off now. We've got a contest. And why don't you show that one? Can you show it quickly?
Which one?
My short video of when we went to Guam in 2008. It's only 2.5 minutes. That was a trip where we went to Lomban, and that's really some great diving. You just came back from there.
Yeah. Fantastic. If you ever want to go to, I mean, Bali has some pretty interesting wide angle. I mean, there's mola molas and big mantas and other big stuff in an area called Nusa Penida. That's it's the straits between Bali's mainland and this island that's east of it. But for us, we like to go to the northeast part of Bali to Tulamben. And we dive right in the shadow of the huge volcano there. And it's all this. One of the things I found, just so you, if you're looking for macro, it seems to me that there's a relationship between the richness of a site and the darkness of the sand. Kind of the more dark the sand, the more nutrient rich it is. And it seems like there's a lot more critters. And so Bali is like Lembe. It has that black volcanic sand and it's just loaded with creatures.
Okay, we're gonna go now directly into the photo contest. We've had quite a few presentations, Steve. And I think this was one of the most informative and one of the most, I think, professionally presented of any that we've had in a long time. We will send you a copy of the file that we saved because I think that it needs to be seen by more people than just us. And I think.
Well, thank you very much for your attention. It's rather lengthy, but I'm happy to communicate offline with anybody here. If you want to, friend requests and come together on social media, it's a great opportunity just to expand the circle of friends and people who love doing what we love to do. And I'm happy to answer any questions offline or give or take advice. And I like feedback as well on my, on my own work, my own images. I still feel like I'm a neophyte at video. I've been working on it fairly intensively for about 8 or 9 months. But I still feel like I'm, a lot of times I'm a beginner. And anyways, it's a lot of fun. I enjoy talking to groups. And so again, thank you for hearing me out.
Well, I'm going to be hammering you on getting us some presentations for our film festival next year. I think that you have the right stuff, as they say, right? In the Air Force thing. Steve, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to shut her down and get out of here. And we will have Mexican food again. Same place, La Tapatía.
Who all's gonna go to La Tapatía? One, keep your hands up, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, you too, right? You're gonna have to get on an SST.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.